I want to take just a few moments of your time to share with you an exciting project that we have going with the charity for the rest of the year. Before I go any further with that, I want to show you why we are doing this project and who we are helping with it. This child's name is Jane, and we found Jane just 1 kilometre away from where we are building our new children's village, which is a 9-hour drive from our existing one. That area has nobody educating, caring for, or trying to assist children with special needs. Jane's mum has to go to work, and so the only option she felt she had to keep her daughter safe was to peg her to the floor, as you see here. This, of course, is not a way of life for anyone, and Jane has lived that way the whole of her life. What we are trying to do is make sure that we can build a solution that's functional for children like Jane. To do that, we need to raise $200,000 by the end of the year. And to do that, we are hoping to get 2,000 volunteers who will agree to fundraise $25 a month, or if you are blessed enough to be able to share that without fundraising, of course, that's an option, every month for the rest of the year. If 2,000 people can commit to doing this, I know, because I have a working blueprint of the village that we currently have, that I can build a working solution that will be able to provide a loving home for 150 special needs children in that location. I also can say that every dollar will go towards construction. Every dollar. And this is a promise that I know I can make, because after 10 years, I think I'm probably better seated than most human beings to fix this problem. If you want to know more about the project, feel free to reach out, or you can visit the link at the bottom of the screen, www.sharetanzania.com/2000 strong. There you'll find out all the information you need. Thank you for the love and support. We can't do what we do for these children without you. God bless, guys. Bye. I am very grateful that I receive a lot of messages that are very personal, and they share the life story of the sender. But what I notice, which is a common theme for all humans, is that predominantly those who choose to share their life story, they are sharing the highlights of trauma, and the identity, therefore, of a victim of that trauma is the main storyline through the memories of their life. And we all do this. I have done this in the past as well. And so I feel I have something to share on this, and very recently in my life with my wonderful wife Fritzi, we had a very miraculous occurrence, in fact. Now, last week someone wrote me asking about trauma, and I feel that ties into having a life story based around traumatic events and the creation of an image of a victim of those traumas. The message, I won't say who you are, but you asked, by paraphrasing my own words, how do you get the soul and the human organism to hit the sleep button on the trauma, on the inability to let go of the memory of the trauma, to forgive it, to pass over it? How do you put that to sleep? What is the mechanism by which you do that? And so I thought I would share from a space as much as I can that's not personal. Because when I share from a personal sense, you will feel this video is about a character in this human organism called John, and therefore it will reflect back to you your character inside of yourself. What I've seen in the life of this human vessel and the records it has passing through this concept of time and memory is that character is not required to overcome that. And this is a tough pill to swallow for many, but we are a human family, and the details of each individual human organism's traumas and tough events that have happened to them are significant and important, but the solution doesn't need to know. From what I've gone through, the details, the solution is universally true despite the details. And that's because we share the same spiritual journey. Awakening is identical in every human being. For all the details of the life will shift and change, and we largely share the same psychological functioning. And so the way to look at it is, any problem you're facing today, another human multiplied potentially by millions is facing that same problem today also, only with different details, but the same emotional problem, the same attachments, the same desires. They're all part of our human story. And so whatever I found inside this organism, you should be able to find inside your organism. Whatever can awaken in the human organism talking to you can awaken in your own. And so it's important to listen in a sense, I feel, where you're going to take all of your awareness and attention and look inwardly. Not look at a character on the screen and agree or disagree with what I say. Take the idea, etc. This is not it. Rather, hopefully together we can see this. Together you can see inside you what I saw inside this human organism, what this human organism fell into in consciousness. And so before I start, trauma, you have a right to talk about your trauma. But if you're talking about your trauma not to release it, I ask the question that you should inquire yourself: am I assisting here to release this and overcome it? Or am I solidifying the identity of a victim from these traumas, which ultimately is the identity that is going to continue the suffering of this trauma? Because that self-image, attachment to that self-image and that story is where it is stored. And so you have a right to share and to talk about it, and you should, but be cautious that you're doing it not just constantly as a way of solidifying, of retaining the identity. Rather, it's about speaking through it so you can look at it and release it and do the work. I have passed as a human vessel talking through trauma, as we all have. And I won't get too personal with the details because they don't matter, but I have. And what I witnessed was that when that trauma was sticking to me, I was living in a way, he is a human organism, he is a human organism. This one has its identity in the present moment, and therefore its life is governed by the divine will that is revealed in consciousness in the present moment. This human organism, its life is determined by the will of a self-image based upon its memories and records of this life and the creation of a persona. When I was living here, the self-image meant that there was someone to be hurt in the vessel. and those pains and hurts would be stored as a memory, and they would affect me deeply, and I would create a contorted, contracted identity around these problems, and it makes you suffer, because when you live on the other side of things, and this is what a Christian is instructed to do in the Bible, it says, lay it at the feet of God. Laying your problems at the feet of God is not linguistic, it's not just verbal. There is a process to this, and it's a state of consciousness. It's a state of consciousness whereby the problems come, and instead of allowing them to stick to the self-image, to be constantly brought up by your memories, that the vessel is here and now in presence. And by having an identity in the revealing of the divine will and consciousness for its life, which only happens now, you can only know God, relate to God here and now. The past is a memory, the future is an illusion. Here and now is the only space you can build that union and relationship with Mother, Father, Creator. When you're in that state of consciousness and something traumatic happens to you, you will feel it. Pain, suffering perhaps, crying, anger, whatever it may be, fear, trembling. But you are not a self-image that's going to retain it and be hurt by it. You are a human organism present in the Eden consciousness, in the presence of awakening. And therefore, you're connected to your emotions. And so what the human vessel needs to feel as its natural state will be felt. And the trauma therefore doesn't stick, because you have ultimately, by staying in that state of consciousness, laid it at the feet of God. You haven't taken it on to the self-image. You've taken it on to the identity of the self in the moment, which is the self in God. The identity in the present moment is the surrendered vessel. It's the vessel living in the presence of God. And so the two states are important to witness and recognize, and you'll know if you're struggling with trauma, you're likely here. This is the experience I went through. Now inside our world, unfortunately, it's a little bit rigged, because you have this identity in presence, the Eden consciousness, we'll reference it that way. Before humanity was whatever symbolically you want to say this represented, were offered the apple by the snake. As I recently said, maybe a genetic interference, whatever caused us to separate from God's will being the governing identity of the human vessel we are, to the notion that our own intelligence and our own ego, etc., will be that governing will. The Eden consciousness and the Eden creation had things inside it that can help you. And the new system, the new identity, you see, we are coerced in immeasurable ways to separate from the original design. We are told even that there are multiple identities that you can adopt that don't match the physiological arising of creation. And this is all a game of mind. It's not a game of freedom and liberation and the presence of God. It's a game of mind. So you're playing out constant mind identities instead of allowing all of your senses to settle, the mind to settle, the self-image to dissipate, and connect to Eden and allow Eden to return you to the God-given identity you had when you were brought into creation. You see this en masse at this present time when it comes to the discussion around gender. We have male, we have female. This is a factual reality. We know this. A female can give birth and a man, etc. We know this, and yet we are led into the idea that there are multiple other identities. But back at the very core foundation, whatever mental game people want to play, back in the Eden creation, you have this identity. And this is important because the system takes you away from things that want to bring you back to that Eden consciousness. They make them illegal. Recently in my own life, Fritzi, which is my wife's name if you don't know, was battling trauma, unresolved from life in Tanzania. We both were, not only Fritzi, we both have had this to deal with, but Fritzi's was stuck, and the light in the eyes of the woman I share this life with was greatly diminished, and her joy and her laughter was rarely present as she wrestled with what had happened. Now the details of these traumas don't matter, but they involve murder and death and a lot of strain, having 2 children whilst I was unwell, etc. The details aren't relevant, but what matters is that she hadn't coped with processing those events when they happened. And so when you don't process emotionally and feel what you need to feel in the moment, that energy is stored somewhere. If you don't feel it now, when do you feel it? It must be felt, or it must be released, because you're packing energy into yourself that needed to be set free. And so I tried many things with Fritzi, and self-inquiry was something that worked very well. And I've done videos where I've done a guided self-inquiry, a short one, and I'll put the video here. A few times I got Fritzi to pop, and she was sitting at the dining table one night and she was just laughing, saying, "Why have I been playing this identity out? Why am I doing this? Like you're here, you're sharing with me, you're leading me out of it. Why have I been feeling so bad retaining this identity of these traumas, of these victims, of this rigidness, because of not wanting to fully allow my heart to love the world, because I'm bringing a memory into that and conditioning that love and saying I'll get hurt if I don't, lacking faith ultimately." And she was laughing, she felt so free, but over the next days it crept back in, and so the release wasn't done correctly. And so as we worked through this, and Fritzi's meditating and she does yoga, which is a great release. It's not religious yoga, but there's a lot of tension and trauma stored in the body. You know when you really stretch out the body that this is so. It's not a religious practice in that sense of the word yoga. She's not adopting any sort of religious structure with it. She's just stretching the body to pop this energy free. One day I was praying and Spirit came to me and said, "Fritzi should microdose psilocybin." Now psilocybin, commonly known magic mushrooms, is something I have microdosed in my life, and you don't get any psychedelic effect from it. It's not a psychedelic trip. I've had psychedelic trips, it's not one. The following night, I spoke with her. We had a fire in our garden and explained. And Fritzi was apprehensive and afraid because she'd never done anything like that. And I told her, "I know that you know when Spirit's spoken to me, and Spirit has said that this is good." And so Fritzi agreed, and she started microdosing. And I had access to psilocybin at the time. You can harvest it in every country in the world pretty much if you know what you're looking for. In the forests, it's a gift from Eden, arguably, and hence its illegality. But it's starting to be used these days. They are using it to treat depression and addiction. But they are not using microdoses in the medical setting, it would seem, as often. But microdosing is what I'm referencing. And microdosing is a very small amount and you feel no psychedelic effect. You shouldn't feel any effect whatsoever. That's how small the dosage is. So Fritzi began, and every 48 hours she would microdose. Within 10 days, it popped. Her trauma began to lift. And not only that, but Spirit spoke to her and told her, and she came and said, "I have to go to a Pentecostal church here." And I've never been to a church in Germany, and so of course we must go. The Pentecostal is very high in spirit, praying in tongues, which is something I do. And so Fritzi and I and the boys, we went to this Pentecostal church, and whilst she was there, Spirit spoke to her and clearly said to Fritzi, "Tell your story." Fritzi got home that night and she started writing her story. Fritzi's story is very different to my own. Fritzi came to Tanzania because she loved a man, myself, and she found God through that when she got there, whereas I was there because God had told me to go. She's also starting a YouTube channel, and I'll put the link on this channel when she does. She's nearly about to launch her first video, I believe, this week actually. So this release was profound. Now the psilocybin didn't heal Fritzi. The psilocybin was a tool Spirit used to open up the programs of the mind and its clumsiness to protect the organism, to allow the grace of God, the presence of God, and therefore the healing of God to be set free inside her, to restore her faith, to deprogram the traumas that she had stored. And it popped after 10 days only, and it was like a miracle. I had tried all kinds, I had prayed endlessly. And this wonderful, what I label a halo, if you've seen the movie Avatar where they plug their hair into the world around them to connect to it, I feel Eden had halos and psilocybin was one. And therefore the system of the fallen ones does not want you to connect to that consciousness, because then you'll start to let go of your dualistic perceptions. Then you'll start to allow the presence of unconditioned love, the will of unconditioned love, to be the driving force that animates your intelligence and the activity of your body, rather than a sense of separation and ultimately, largely in this world, a sense of entertainment, distraction, and becoming God through technological advancement, dissecting God based on the will only of the characters that are born inside of us by the system, telling us to go in this linear progressive state of consciousness, build a persona only, and never really be reborn, as Yeshua called it, be free here and now. Attuned to life and God's presence and will, rather than in the future you'll get your cookie. Taking a child and putting them in school and educating a small paradigm of their brain and telling them in the future they'll get what they're looking for may be necessary in some elements, but we must balance it by taking the child and saying, align yourself to the will of the one who knit you together in your mother's womb, of the one blooming the flowers, because that innate intelligence is within you, and thought is profoundly limited. Thought is doing very little in your life. It's only the arrogance of the ego that doesn't recognize that. The arrogance of the ego thinks thought is the be-all and end-all. It does very, very little in your life. It's not dealing with the millions of processes in your body have nothing to do with thought. It's very limited. And so the question is, can you live from a space where thought is not the number one that we place, as our society does, and rather the will, the space of unconditioned love is? And so in Fritzi's instance, it was psilocybin that allowed the sleep button to be hit. In my instance, when I was younger, as someone who adopted an identity, this vessel has a memory of adopting an identity of a victim to such a degree, to such a contracted state, that I ended up severely ill. And many of you know 20 years ago now that I took an overdose when I was a teenager. And I was contracted. And I then had my experience with psychiatrists. And I recognize in the same manner that Ram Dass said it more beautifully than I think anyone I've ever heard say it. He felt like he was living his life in a bad-fitting suit, and this was his persona. And so he would go to a psychiatrist, and the psychiatrist would say, take that suit off and put on this suit that I've got. And it was still ill-fitting. The reality is, it's when you take the suit off that you get the freedom that the soul is yearning for. But psychiatrists, and they are needed in our world, I have love and respect for them, sometimes struggle because they have spent their adult life being taught that they must make the self-image function, that they must make it comfortable. Whereas those of us who have a spiritual awakening and lay it at the feet of God, as it were, we recognize that it's only when that self-image goes that the true potency of joy of life and wholeness arises. I know psychiatrists who can't even forgive their family, meaning they carry with them unresolved trauma, and are then in the world trying to tell other human beings how to live well, how to navigate. And so I'm sure they can help, but there's limitations there, because you're asking someone to take an ill-fitting suit, the technology of the self-image which has arisen in them, and try to reprogram it to be a different one. The reality is that the identity of the self-image is the cause of the ill-fit, and changing the identity to one that is surrendered into the present moment and recognizing the divine will for your life, recognizing that you don't know what this is. You don't know what life is, you don't know where you are, you don't know what it's about. It requires at some stage an element of surrender. The arrogant self-image will struggle to admit it, but once it does admit it, the vessel can't be far away from putting that image to sleep. And so I carried trauma as the records and memories in this human organism speaking with you. And mine were released in fasting at first. Prolonged fasting hit the sleep button. In my wife's instance, microdosing psilocybin hit the sleep button. When you ultimately recognize the space between identifying with the self-image and its story and the space of presence, I feel that once you can know the two, you can recognize that you just need to root and anchor in that presence. Even in recent years, this human organism speaking with you in Africa didn't take time when I was doing the work I was for God to, in my arrogance, in my pride of a self-image, a spiritual ego that had formulated inside my mind, I did not take time to process events and allow space for God, to allow space to put it at the feet of God. I was putting it on a self-image, a spiritual ego. I went through traumas too, of friends being murdered, etc. Children who I loved, who I still love dearly, passed away in my arms in one such instance. And these are things to process as human organisms when you've been a guardian for 4 years of a child like that. It's something that goes in and you don't recognize how deeply. Last year I made videos that I came to be in presence here in the forests of Germany, and I just sat in presence. No self-image sat in presence. The human organism recognized its connection to the present moment and remained there. And the self-image remained quiet. Any identity I built was an identity of pure awareness and attentiveness to life being revealed to my senses here and now, the only place God is present. And in time, I was meditating one evening and I shook. I've covered it in videos, and I shook violently, very violently, for 30 minutes or more. And then when it was over, I felt immense grief for 48, maybe longer hours. And the grief had no direction, no character, no person, just emanating, just feeling it. And I recognized that the grief of the loss of these wonderful children in my life and under the elements, dogs, etc., I hadn't made space at the time to feel it, and so instead of my body feeling what it needed to in the presence, my arrogant ego had grabbed and said, no, we have to get on with things, because it lacked faith. If it had faith, it would have said, I have time to process this because God has my back. And so the ego lacks faith, it grabs, no, I can't. And in doing that, I kept storing this energy, and it shook free from my body violently. And so you ask the question, how? How does one hit the sleep button? How does one get the soul and the human vessel to hit the sleep button? The first question you should ask: are you engaging? Do an inquiry. Are you trying to engage the character that stores the trauma in its memories to do that action? And if so, try to find the space where you sense some freedom. If it lasts for 1 second, do a self-inquiry, etc. When you sense that freedom, recognize that that is the space you need to be. And what will happen for many, they'll hit that freedom, and then the character will come in and say, how do I hang on to that? And by it asking that question, it takes the freedom away, because you've engaged the character in the space whereby which the presence of God should be cleansing, healing, and providing you with that supernatural love that is needed to bring the forgiveness to your problems that is needed. Ask the question, am I trying to engage the character to eliminate the character? This is what I would say. And when you can touch that presence, you see, I can only point at it and hope that you go inside. Because woe unto the lawgivers, they take away the keys to the kingdom, for they do not enter within. We've been told the answer's outside, but our healing is always to go in. And I can only point at that and point you at asking the right questions. Am I trying to use the character to shut down the character? If so, you're going to keep enforcing the character's existence. Or am I now at the space where I recognize the character's need is not there for this process? And through inquiry, I recognize the truth of who I am is beyond this character and these memories. And when you sense any sense of expansiveness, you must throw your anchor into that space and try to remain there. And if you will fall away, you come back to it and you do what you need to do to stay there. And the more time you can spend in that space of freedom and presence, in that space of freedom and presence, the soul and the human organism is shaking its back of the story of the self-image which is punishing you. And the longer you stay there, the more deeper the healing and cleansing you receive. When Fritzi had her problems, it was the grace of God that healed her. My prayers led to an idea from Spirit. The use of the halo, the psilocybin, opened up the mind, which is where the self-image is, enough for the grace to move in and to do its work. And God is waiting and wants you well, wants you healed, did not want you to be traumatized and hurt, but can't get in to do the work so long as the mind is getting in the way. And that's why we must walk into a space of ultimate faith, humility. Humility is a state of consciousness. It's a space where the human vessel can enter a space where the self-image isn't trying to dictate and determine and control things. Where the human vessel says, I trust the will of the divine to do this. And in there, through faith, you will get there. And when you finally open up the mind through that faith, grace will reach in and change everything. Will heal you, will take away this self-image and give you a new identity. An identity in the presence, love and joy and contentment of God and the eternal love that is the core essence of your soul. This is how it was for this human organism talking to you. The many children we've healed of trauma and family and friends, and so I can only share from that perspective, the spiritual perspective of dealing with trauma. This is what I can bring to the world, and I hope it has some benefit and relief for those of you struggling. We all carry a shadow of trauma. I've no doubt things to take out still as well. But they are not taken out by the character and its efforts. They are taken out by the human organism abandoning the character and allowing the grace of God to remove it for you in the presence of the now consciousness, the awakened state, the state of rebirth. God bless, guys. Be well.